A hand grabbed a fistful of wet hair and yanked hard. A woman screamed and hit the mud on her knees. Boots circled her. One man laughed. Another spat and hauled her up by the collar, tearing the seam. Rain came down in sheets. Nobody on the street moved. Doors closed, curtains dropped. A shopkeeper turned his sign to closed and looked at the floor. The woman reached out one shaking hand toward the crowd. "Please," she said, "somebody help me. She will destroy her." Not one soul stepped forward. Then an old man set down a sack of feed on his porch. Silas Renner had not touched a gun in 15 years. He was 61, gray, slow in one hip, and he stepped off that porch into the rain. What one worn-out old cowboy did next would change that whole town forever. Stay with me on this one now. Let me back up an hour because that's where it really starts. The door of the feed store had banged open hard enough to rattle the seed jars. A woman fell through it and hit the plank floor on her hands and knees. She was soaked through, mud to the elbows, one cheek swollen dark. Silas looked up from a barrel of oats and did not move fast. He never moved fast anymore. The dog moved first. Juniper. One eye gray around the muzzle, half a tail from a wolf years back. She got up from the warm spot by the stove and put herself between the woman and the door. She did not growl. She just watched the street. "Please, mister," the woman said. "Lock the door, please." Silas set down his scoop. He walked over, careful of his bad hip, and he pushed the door shut and dropped the bar across it. Then he crouched down next to her, slow, his knees popping like green wood in a fire. "You're bleeding," he said. "Sit up against the counter, there you go." She was young, 25 maybe. Her name was Etta Callum and her husband had been dead 8 months. She told Silas that much between breaths. Fever had taken the man in the spring and the doctor's bill had taken everything after. And that, she said, was when Delphine Hale came calling. Now, you have to understand who Delphine Hale was in that town. She owned the biggest spread in the territory. 50,000 head, a house with real glass windows, and a payroll of men who wore their guns low and their smiles lower. But cattle wasn't her real business. Paper was. She held mortgages on half of Cheyenne, the livery, the mercantile, 3 farms out past the creek. When a man got behind, Delphine's clerk showed up with a leather book and a pen, and the man signed because the other choice was Delphine's men. Etta pulled a folded paper out of her dress. It was wet and coming apart at the creases, but Silas could read it. A debt. $400, it said, owed by the estate of the late Thomas Callum to the Hale Land and Cattle Company, signed and witnessed. "I never signed this," Etta said. "Thomas never signed this. That isn't his hand, I told her. I told her to her face." "What'd she say?" "She said the law wouldn't care whose hand it was." Etta's voice cracked. "She said I could work it off at the house. Cooking, washing, whatever the men wanted. She said a widow with no money and no kins got no standing to argue." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "And there's my sister, Josie. She's 15. Delphine says if I run, Josie works the debt instead." That last part landed in the room like a dropped stone. Silas didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at that paper. Here's the thing about Silas Renner. 15 years back, he'd been a trail boss and before that, a deputy marshal down in Kansas. He'd worn a brass star and he'd been good with a gun, better than most men wanted to be. Then one bad night he'd buried somebody he loved on account of a fight that wasn't worth the powder, and he'd hung the gun on a nail and walked away from all of it. Came north. Bought a feed store on the quiet edge of town, sold oats and salt lick and kept to himself. Folks knew he'd been something once. They also knew he'd stopped being it. That was fine by everyone, most of all Silas. "Why my store?" he asked her, not unkind, just curious. Etta looked at him with those wet, scared eyes. "Because I asked at 3 doors before yours and they all shut in my face. Yours was the only one at the edge of town. I figured maybe a man out here don't owe her anything." Silas almost laughed at that. Almost. Because it was true. He was the one man in Cheyenne who didn't owe Delphine Hale a dime. He'd bought his little place outright with trail money years ago, and he'd never once needed her paper. He got up. He fetched a clean rag and a tin cup of water and set them next to her. He put a stick of jerky down where Juniper could see it, and the dog took it soft off the floorboards and lay down against Etta's leg like she'd decided something. "Drink," Silas said. "Rest a minute, I'll figure what to do about." That's when they heard the horses, 4 of them coming slow up the muddy street. Silas moved to the window and looked out past the sacks stacked in the display. 4 riders. He knew the lead man by the black hat and the way he sat a saddle like he owned the ground under it. Cole Bragg, Delphine's foreman, the man who did the talking right up until it was time for the other thing. Etta made a small sound in her throat. "They followed me." "Stay down," Silas said. "Behind the counter, take the dog." And he unbarred his own door and stepped out onto the porch into the rain to meet them. "That's where you came in." Cole Bragg reined up in front of the store. Behind him, the other 3 fanned out easy, hands loose. Bragg smiled up at the old man on the porch and touched his hat brim like they were friends. "Renner," he said, "didn't figure you for a man who took in strays." "Didn't figure you for a man who beat women in the street," Silas said. "But here we both are." Bragg's smile stayed put. "That woman owes Miss Hale $400. That's a legal debt. We're here to collect the collateral, which, seeing as she's got no money, is her time. Nothing personal about it. Just business." That's when it happened. One of the riders, a kid with a soft face and a hard gun, walked his horse right up to the porch, leaned down off the saddle and grabbed a fistful of Etta's shawl. She'd crept to the doorway, you see, to watch. He yanked. She screamed. And that scream is the one you heard at the very start, the one that dropped through that whole silent street and hit the mud. Now, what happened next took maybe 4 seconds. Silas didn't reach for a gun because he didn't have one on him and hadn't in 15 years. What he had was a feed scoop, cast iron, heavy as a skillet, hanging on a nail by the door. He took it down in one motion and swung it flat against the kid's grabbing arm. The bone gave with a crack you could hear over the rain. The kid howled and let go of the shawl and grabbed his own wrist, and his horse spooked and dumped him sideways into the mud. The other 2 started to move. Silas already had the kid's dropped pistol in his hand. He'd caught it out of the air off the man's belt as he fell, quicker than a 61-year-old man with a bad hip has any right to be. And the whole street saw it. The old feed man, standing on his porch, a pistol in one fist and an iron scoop in the other, and something in his face that none of them had ever seen before. Something cold and certain and awful. "Next hand that touches her," Silas said, real quiet, "I take it off at the wrist. That's not a threat, Cole. That's just what happens." Cole Bragg stopped smiling. For a long moment nobody moved. The rain drummed on the porch roof. The kid moaned in the mud. Silas didn't wave the gun around. He didn't shout. He just held it low and easy, the way a man holds a tool he's used 10,000 times, and that stillness said more than any shouting could. "You just made a mistake, old man," Bragg said finally. "Made plenty," Silas answered. "This ain't one of them. Get your boy and get off my street." And here's the part the town would tell for years. Cole Bragg backed down. He climbed off his horse, hauled the crying kid up out of the mud, threw him over a saddle, and he and the other 2 turned and rode back the way they came. Slow, making a show of not hurrying, but leaving. The street just stood there stunned. Then one by one the doors and curtains people had shut. They opened them again, just a crack, to look. The shopkeeper who'd flipped his sign to closed stood behind his glass with his mouth open. and Silas Renner stepped back inside his store, barred the door, and set the iron scoop back on its nail. Etta was shaking against the counter with Juniper pressed to her side. "They'll come back," she whispered. "You don't know her. She always comes back." "I know," Silas said. He set the borrowed pistol on the counter, muzzle to the wall like it was something dirty. Then he did the thing that made Etta believe, for one whole minute, that maybe it was over. He filled the coffee pot from the rain barrel and set it on the stove. He wiped the mud off the floor with an old sack. He crouched down and looked at Juniper's paws to make sure the dog hadn't cut herself. He handed Etta a dry blanket off the shelf. Then he lowered himself into his chair by the stove with a groan, and he poured 2 cups, and he sat back. And for the first time all morning, the old man's shoulders came down from around his ears. "Drink your coffee," he told her. "Storm's passing. Roads'll dry by noon. We'll get you and your sister on the afternoon coach and out of this territory, and that'll be the end of Delphine Hale for the both of you." Etta wrapped her cold hands around the warm cup. Outside, the rain was easing to a drizzle. The street was quiet. She almost smiled. That's when the knock came, not a bang. A polite, patient 3-tap knock, and a voice on the other side of the door, a woman's voice, smooth as cream. "Mr. Renner," it said, "my name is Delphine Hale, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Etta's cup slipped and shattered on the floor. Silas got up slow. He didn't take down the scoop. He didn't pick up the pistol. He walked to the door, lifted the bar, and opened it a hand's width. Delphine Hale stood on his porch under a black umbrella held by a man in a gray suit. She was maybe 50, handsome, silver at the temples, dressed like money. And here's the part that changed everything, the part where this stopped being a fist fight and became something a whole lot worse. She wasn't alone with her gunmen. Beside her stood a fat man with a badge on his coat and a folded paper in his hand. "This is Sheriff Del Hooker," Delphine said pleasantly. "He has a warrant for the arrest of Etta Callum, theft of property, and now, thanks to your little performance, assault on my men and interference with a lawful collection." She smiled. "You've been out of the game a long time, Mr. Renner, so let me remind you how it works now. I don't need guns to take that girl. I've got the law. I've got the judge. I own the paper this whole town stands on." She tilted her head. "The only question is whether you go to jail with her." Now here's the thing. Silas had spent 15 years being sure he'd never step back into that world. And in the space of one morning, it had walked right up onto his porch and knocked polite. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the sheriff, who wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked at Delphine Hale, who met them just fine. And he did something nobody expected. He laughed. A short, dry, tired laugh. "Sheriff Hooker," Silas said, "you still bank at the Mercantile, course you do. And who holds the mortgage on the Mercantile?" He nodded slow. "Right, so that badge don't mean law, it means she pays you." He looked at Delphine. "You didn't bring the law, ma'am. You brought a hired man with a tin star. There's a difference. I used to wear one of those for real." Delphine's smile thinned just a hair. "Take the girl," she told the sheriff. And that was the moment Silas Renner, who had promised himself he was done, stepped all the way back in. He stepped into the doorway and filled it with his body, and he said, "You'll want to see something first, before you make this a hanging matter and not a debt matter. Because a debt, Delphine, a debt you can win in your bought court, but fraud." He let the words sit there. "Fraud gets a territorial marshal down from the capital, and that's a court you don't own." Delphine went very still. "If you're still with me on this one, and I hope you are because it's about to get good, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this old cowboy's story reach the folks who need to hear it. All right. Back to that porch." "What did you say?" Delphine said. Not a question, a warning. "Said fraud." Silas reached into his vest, slow so nobody got nervous, and pulled out the wet debt paper Etta had given him. This note says the Callum estate owes you 400, signed by Thomas Callum. Only Thomas Callum died in April. He tapped the paper. And this note's dated June. You had a dead man signed for money 3 months after you buried him. He looked up. Now I ran cattle for 20 years. I kept ledgers. And I'd bet my store this ain't the only dead man on your books. How many other widows, Delphine? How many other farms you took with paper signed by folks in the ground? The sheriff looked down at the warrant in his hand like it had turned into a snake. Delphine Hale recovered fast. You had to give her that. A clerk's error in a date, she said smoothly. Easily corrected, it changes nothing. Sheriff, do your. There's a man, Silas cut in, keeps your books. Little fella, spectacles, comes to town Thursdays for the bank. Barrett, ain't it? Amos Barrett. He watched her eyes when he said it, and he saw the flinch, small but there. Amos Barrett writes down everything. Men like that always do. Every crooked note, every forged name, every date. It's all in his hand in your ledger because you made him do it, and one day when this goes bad, he wants to be able to say he only did what he was told. Silas smiled without any warmth at all. So here's my offer. You take that warrant and you tear it up right here on my porch. Or I get on this afternoon's coach myself, ride to the Capitol and put Amos Barrett in your ledger in front of a United States Marshal. Your choice, ma'am, but choose quick. Roads dry by noon. The rain had stopped. Water dripped off the porch roof, one slow drop at a time, and every drop sounded loud in the quiet. Delphine Hale looked at the old man for a long time. Then she smiled, and it was the coldest thing on that whole cold morning. You clever old fool, she said softly. You have no idea what you've started. She turned to the sheriff. Put the warrant away, Del, for now. And she looked back at Silas. You want to talk about ledgers? Fine, come to my house, tonight. Bring the girl if you like. We'll talk like reasonable people. And Mr. Renner, the smile again. Do come alone of your guns. Oh, that's right, you don't have any. She turned and walked to her carriage, and the man in gray held the umbrella over her head even though the rain had quit, and they drove off. The sheriff went last, and at the bottom of the steps he stopped, and without turning around he said, Lo, that date thing. Is it true? It's true, Silas said. The sheriff nodded once and left. Silas shut the door and leaned his forehead against it. Etta was staring at him. You just walked us into her house, she whispered. Her house, Silas. That's where the men are. That's where nobody can see. I know, he said. Then why? He turned around. Because the ledger's in her house, and a threat's only good if you can make it real. I don't just need to scare her off you and your sister. I need to break her. Or she buries us both and every soul who ever helped us, and this town stays hers another 20 years. He looked tired and old and absolutely certain. I need Amos Barrett's book, Etta, tonight. The Hale house sat up on a rise outside town, all lit windows and white paint, with a bunkhouse off to the side where the guns slept. Silas drove up in his own wagon just after dark, Etta beside him because she'd flat refused to stay behind, and Juniper in the bed because the dog refused to stay behind too. Cole Bragg met them at the gate with 2 men. He wasn't smiling now. He patted Silas down rough and found nothing because there was nothing to find. No gun, Bragg said, surprised in spite of himself. Told you, Silas said. Been 15 years. They walked him into a big front room with a fire and leather chairs, and there sat Delphine Hale like a queen, and behind her, standing nervous by the wall, was a small man in spectacles with ink on his fingers. Amos Barrett. Silas clocked him and looked away, casual, like he hadn't. Sit, Delphine said. She poured whiskey nobody drank. Let's be practical. You want the Callum debt gone, done. I'll tear it up tonight, both sisters free and clear. You want money to go away quiet, name it. 1,000 too, she leaned forward. And in exchange, you forget all about clerks' errors and ledgers and marshals. Everybody wins. The girl goes free. You go home rich. And Cheyenne stays exactly as it is. She smiled. That's a good deal, Mr. Renner, take it. And you know, for a heartbeat it was tempting. Etta free, the whole thing over, $2,000. Silas could see her waiting for his answer, hoping he'd take it. But here's what Silas knew that Etta didn't. A woman like Delphine doesn't tear up the paper that would send her to prison. She tears up you. The minute they took her money and walked out that door, they'd have an accident on the dark road home. Both of them. And Josie, the sister, she'd disappear into that house and never come out. So Silas set down the whiskey he wasn't drinking and he said, "No." The room went quiet. "No," Delphine said. "Free the sisters. Tear up every crooked note on every family in this town. Sign over the mortgages back to the folks you stole them from, and confess it in writing in front of the whole town tomorrow morning." Silas leaned back. "Do that, and I let you keep your ranch and your life, and I don't ride to the Capitol. That's my deal, Delphine. That's the only one on the table." Delphine Hale laughed, and this time it was real, delighted, terrible. "You came into my house," she said, "surrounded by my men with no gun and no help and no card to play but a scared little clerk who does what I tell him. And you make demands." She nodded at Bragg. "Cole, the old man's had an accident. He came to threaten me and things got out of hand. The girl, too. Such a shame." She stood up, smoothing her dress. "Amos, you'll witness that it was self-defense, won't you? And that little man by the wall, Amos Barrett with the ink-stained fingers," he said in a shaking voice. "No, no, I won't." Everybody turned to look at him. "I've written it all down," Amos said, and now he was crying, but he kept talking. "Every forgery, every dead man's name, 12 families, 12 Miss Hale. I wrote them because you'd have thrown my wife out in the snow if I didn't, but I kept a second book, a true one, the dates, the real signatures, your instructions in your own words." He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small leather ledger and held it up in 2 hands like it was on fire. "Mr. Renner's right. It goes to the marshal. It has to. I can't do it anymore. I can't." You should have seen Delphine's face. Because here's the thing Silas had counted on, and it's the whole reason he came into that house without a gun. He didn't come for a fight. He came to give one broken, frightened, decent man the one thing he'd never had. A reason to be brave, and one other brave person in the room to do it beside. "Cole," Delphine said, and her voice cracked for the first time all day. "Take that book." Bragg took a step toward Amos. And Silas said, "Cole, before you do that, you know what's in that book too. Your name's in it. Every man you leaned on, every farm you cleared, every widow you dragged through the mud. She wrote it all down and hung it around your neck same as his." He stood up, slow, his knees popping. "You take that book to protect her, you're protecting the rope that hangs you. Or you can walk out that door a free man tonight and let this be her sin, not yours. That's your deal, Cole. Same as everybody else in this rotten town. You want to keep being hers, or you want to be your own man for once." Cole Bragg stood there between the old cowboy and the Baroness, and you could see 15 years of doing what he was told sitting heavy on his shoulders. He looked at Delphine. He looked at the shaking clerk holding up that little book. And then Cole Bragg took off his hat of all things and he said, "I got a widow's blood on my hands already, ma'am. Believe I'll stop there." And he walked out. The other 2 men looked at each other and followed him, just like that. Delphine Hale was alone in her big lit room with an old man, a widow, a crying clerk, and a one-eyed dog. She lunged for the ledger herself fast, but Etta got there first. Etta Callum, bruised and half-starved and terrified, she stepped in front of that book and she looked the woman dead in the eye and she said, "You put my dead husband's name on a lie. You are not touching this." And she didn't move. And Delphine, for all her men and her money and her paper, could not make her move. It was over, and everyone in that room knew it. The next morning the whole town came out into the street, because word travels fast in a place that size. The territorial marshal arrived on the noon coach 2 days later, and by then Amos Barrett's true book had already done its work. 12 families. Delphine Hale had forged notes against 12 families, most of them widows and old folks and people too scared to check, and she'd taken land and livery and store on the strength of dead men's signatures. The marshal read that ledger and put Delphine Hale in irons on her own front porch, under her own real glass windows, and drove her to the Capitol to stand in a court she did not own. The mortgages, the crooked ones, a territorial judge tore them up. The livery went back to the man who'd built it. The 3 farms past the creek went back to the folks who'd farmed them. And the town of Cheyenne, which had looked at the floor and shut its curtains and turned its sign to closed while a woman got dragged through the mud, that town had to sit with what it had almost let happen. Some men couldn't look Silas in the eye for a good while after. That was all right. He wasn't asking them to. Cole Bragg left the territory. Rumor was he went to Montana and took work on a straight outfit and never touched a gun in anger again. Amos Barrett kept books for the new bank, honest ones, and folks say he stood a little taller the rest of his life. And Sheriff Del Hooker turned in his badge before anyone could ask him to, which was the one decent thing he'd done in years, so nobody made him swing for the rest. Etta and her sister Josie stayed. Silas offered to put them on any coach they wanted anywhere, but Etta shook her head. "This is where Thomas is buried," she said. "I'm not running from home, not anymore." So she took the little room over the feed store and she kept the books for Silas, and she was good at it, better than him, and the store did better in a year than it had in 10. Josie grew up safe. That was the thing Silas cared about most, if you want to know the truth, that the 15-year-old grew up safe. As for Silas Renner, he put the borrowed pistol in the stove and melted it down and never got another one, and he never needed to. He was still slow in the hip, still gray, still up at dawn with the oats and the salt lick. But something had come back into that old man's face, and it stayed there, and folks who'd known him 15 years said they'd never seen him lighter. One evening near the end of that summer, Etta found him out on the porch in the last of the light, Juniper's gray head resting on his boot, the dog's one good eye half closed. Etta sat down next to him. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "That first morning, you didn't owe me anything. You didn't owe this town anything. You could have kept your door shut like everybody else and nobody would have blamed you." Silas was quiet a while. Down the street, a lamp came on in a window that used to belong to Delphine Hale, and now belonged to a family that had earned it back. 15 years ago, he said, I stood in a street a lot like that one, and there was somebody needed me to step off a porch, and I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my fight, and I buried her that week. He rubbed the dog's ear slow. I promised I was done with all of it, guns, fights, standing up. Told myself keeping quiet was the same as keeping the peace. He shook his head. It ain't. Keeping quiet's just how the Delphine Hales of the world get to win. I knew that the whole 15 years. I just needed one more woman screaming in the rain to remember it out loud. He looked over at her. You reached your hand out to a whole street full of people, he said, and everybody looked away. Everybody but a broke-down old man and a half-blind dog. He almost smiled. Turned out that was enough. Most times it is. Takes just one person willing to step off the porch. The rest of them, they only need somebody to go first. The sun went all the way down. Juniper sighed in her sleep. And Silas Renner sat on his porch in the quiet town he'd helped set right, an old cowboy who'd finally forgiven himself, and he didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Sometimes the bravest thing a man ever does isn't drawing a gun. It's opening a door.